Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. We haven't done a talking transit video for some time, and I wanted to get back into it. So today we're talking to Toban Allison. He's a wayfinding expert at Metrolinx. He's going to tell us about how he kind of got into wayfinding and why he thinks it's important, and maybe some other interesting factoids and stuff. And so, yeah, let's get into it. So, Tobin, can you kind of tell me a bit about yourself? How did you get into wayfinding, etc.?
Sure. Well, thanks first of all for having me on. In terms of myself and how I got into wayfinding, it's a bit of a circuitous journey, to be honest. I actually studied journalism, and coming out of school, I lived in Vancouver, much like yourself, at the time, and it was in the lead up to the 2010 Olympics. I was really determined to get a job working on the games, and I did. And that spurned an interest in sort of the customer service aspects of large scale events like that. And so I worked in that capacity on the Vancouver Games and then moved to the London Games in 2012. And that really was my first sort of interaction with a wayfinding system that worked really well. I was taking the tube to work every day, and I was just amazed by the sort of efficiency and the care and the diligence that was put into making these signs and the maps and everything about that system work as well as it did. So once those games were over, I continued to work in that capacity for a while, but I was sort of secretly behind the scenes learning as much as I could about wayfinding. And luckily enough, in 2015, I ended up applying for and then ultimately being offered a job working with Metrolinx in a wayfinding capacity.
So I guess my next sort of question is regarding the Crosstown. So Eglinton Crosstown's a really interesting project. Really excited to see it opening soon, hopefully. And one thing that everyone is, I think, curious about and a lot of people have discussed is Cedarvale for Eglinton West. Like Eglinton West is being renamed to Cedarvale, and there's a couple other station names and that don't necessarily associate with the road names. And so I'm curious if you can kind of explain your rationale and the rationale for why that you guys are kind of taking that policy with station naming.
Sure. If you'll indulge me, I'm going to take I'll answer the Cedarvale question in a second. I just wanted to perhaps give a bit of context around where that naming process came from and why we approach naming in the way that we do. So I think there's a narrative out there, if I could, or perhaps a perception that we hired some consultants to name stations on the Crosstown. And I think that isn't really the case. We would not, and I can say with relative confidence, will not be using consultants in that capacity. Ever. We had hired consultants to look at, over the course of 18 months, in a rather comprehensive fashion, all the issues that surrounded wayfinding in the region writ large. And that really consisted of a great deal of research. So our research program was focused on, first of all, customers. So we had a series of intercept interviews with people at transit stations. We had a series of focus groups. We also gave customers journey assignments and asked them to document what challenges they encountered along the way. And we also had a steering committee that consisted of representation from all the municipal operators in the region. And we had a series of meetings and workshops with them to really work through some of the challenges that we might face in further integrating the individual wayfinding systems that were out there into one larger sort of regional system. Coming out of that research was 6 white papers that focused on modal iconography, accessibility considerations, the codes that we give our routes and bus numbers, etc. And along with that was a white paper that focused on naming. And arising out of that was a recommendation around the process that we should use to apply names to our stations. And so the first opportunity that we had to apply that process was to the Eglinton Crosstown. And in that white paper, there was a series of recommendations that were made specific to the crosstown, but also to all the infrastructure region-wide, both existing and future, that we would maybe need to tackle if we were going to make this naming system work the way it should. So I just wanted to sort of clear the air a little bit around the fact that we wouldn't ever hire a consultant directly to name stations for us. And indeed, the person that we ended up having make those recommendations specific to Eglinton actually was local and had been working in transit for several years prior. So specific to Cedar Vale and some of the other stations along the crosstown, I think it's our policy, lowercase p policy, is basically this. We only name stations after one of three things: streets, neighborhoods, landmarks. And in a rapid transit context where you have stations that are somewhat close together, certainly closer together than in a regional rail context, for instance, street names are obviously the go-to when it comes to what name you might want to refer to a station as. And the only instance in which we don't pursue that is if there is a conflict. And what I mean by conflict is we duplicate a station name that already exists in the system. And I guess when I say the system, I'm not only referring to the subway network, but the transit network writ large regionally. And the reason why we don't duplicate names is twofold. First of all, for a newcomer, someone who isn't especially familiar with Toronto, they may not know, for instance, that Yonge Street is the dividing line between east and west in the city. They may not know much about the geography of the city and where St. Clair is versus where Bloor is. And so to ask someone in that context to differentiate between a Lawrence and a Lawrence West or Lawrence East, it's really challenging. And I say that with personal experience, that understanding the difference between those various things can be pretty difficult. When I first moved to Toronto, I ended up being invited to a friend's place and went to St. Clair West when I should have gone to St. Clair. And I think coupled with that is the fact that in a subway context, you're underground, and therefore your references to what's above you don't exist. You are reliant entirely on the information that you're given by way of maps or announcements that are in the system. And so in that case, it's more important for you to understand how the station you want to alight at relates to every other station in the system, more so than it is how your station relates to what's above ground. And so because of that, we may think it's really important to keep the names as different as we possibly can, even to the point of trying our best not to append names to other names. As I think many people have said about Eglinton Station, well, why aren't you calling it Eglinton Yonge? And the reason for that is the repetition of those words, Yonge at Bloor Yonge and Eglinton Yonge and Shepherd Yonge, can be a problem, because with double-barreled names, people will often drop one of the names. And the example that I always give is we've heard that there have been several people that have shown up at Bloor Yonge Station with luggage looking to get on the Up Express, simply because they didn't realize that Bloor and Bloor Yonge were different things. So we do our best to keep all the station names separate and as unique as we can, just purely for a functional reason. And specific to Cedar Vale and Fairbank and some others, we went through a consultation stage post-public consultation, but prior to this going to our board, where we engaged with the local elected officials. And I think in the case of Cedar Vale, there was a informal poll that was taken by the local councillor to weigh Allen, which I think might have been perhaps slightly better recognized, with Cedar Vale, which is a nearby park. And ultimately, Cedar Vale won that informal poll. And it really wasn't sort of incompatible with our approach, so we decided to adopt that again based on that suggestion. And indeed, there were several adjustments to our initial round of station names that were made based on the local councillors' inputs. O'Connor is one of them. Sloan instead of Bermondsey was another. So we do our best to not only talk to the general public, but also to the local elected officials and make sure that we're putting forward something that is representative of their wards and their ridings in a way that by the time it gets to our board, we're pretty confident that we've gotten things pretty correct. So I hope that offers a little bit of insight into just why it's the way we do.
Okay, so my next question is in relation to the T logo, which you can actually see on your Go bus sign right there. It's quite interesting. So I think it's also been spotted on some Eglinton Crosstown stuff. So why the T logo, and how did you guys kind of come to use that, and why do you think maybe it's important to have like that kind of unifying symbol for transit?
Sure. I think first of all, it's we within our wayfinding program have a series of sort of principles. Both some of them are more formal, and others are sort of in internal guidance or internal thoughts that we use when we're exploring issues like this. One of them is to design from the customer's existing knowledge. And in tackling something like a logo for regional transit, or a symbol for regional transit, I should say, I think there was, and I was very tempted by the idea that we should do something unique and ownable, and that was, sort of like the London Underground roundel, that was a symbol of the city as much as it was a symbol for transit. But that really wasn't within the spirit of what we were trying to accomplish, or what we are trying to accomplish with the program. And so we approached this, I think, in a quite earnest way, and it might seem a bit silly for us to start with a T as a placeholder, which is what's been in a lot of the crosstown renderings that have been out there, and then end up in a place with a very similar T as the end result. But I think the process that we took to get there was valid, and I think it's ultimately we would have made a poor decision had we not gone through that process. So we knew that we wanted to have a symbol to represent the network, and it was really about creating a sense of confidence in the customer using the system, that all these different disparate services were working together in some way, shape, or form. So ideally, if you're in Durham and you see the T, and then you end up taking Durham Region Transit and transferring to the TTC and then onto My Way, you see the T throughout, and that is the element that is consistent. And ideally, when you have that level of consistency, you start to become more confident in taking transit conceptually. And then obviously, the more confident you are in taking transit, the more inclined you are to use transit again. And so it was really about sort of creating a sense of confidence in the customer, and in turn, getting more people to take up transit as their primary means of travel. We went through I think a very sort of detailed exercise on the development, quote unquote, of the T. And that was, we approached it not wanting to conclude what the symbol should be without having earnestly, I think, gone through the development of it. So we had started with a long list of about close to 100 different symbols. Some of them were really good, and others were not very good. And we whittled that down to, I think, 14 ultimately. And there were sort of different approaches. We had abstract symbols, we had use of existing logos, we had letters, and then we had sort of more literal representations of transit, sort of in a pictographic sense. And we ruled out a lot of those because they weren't totally achieving what we wanted it to achieve. So a pictogram that represents a specific transit vehicle is easy. A pictogram to represent all transit vehicles is pretty hard. Existing logos were a challenge for us because the wayfinding systems that are in existence now are all almost entirely dependent on the logo as the symbol that you see first. And that really requires the customer to understand that logo, or to understand what TTC is before they can use the system, and that's a barrier to people using transit. And so we basically knew that a letter or an abstract symbol was going to be the direction that we ended up going. We took that to our residents reference panel, which is a panel of, I think, 36 people from around the region and the panel is weighted such that it represents the demographics of the region accurately. And we ended up picking an abstract symbol. It was two chevrons. It sort of probably in the end looked too close to the SEPTA logo for us to really use it. But we tested that. And I think it was important that we tested an abstract symbol as well, because a T would have perhaps been too literal. It wouldn't have lent itself to sort of easy testing, whereas something that's sort of nebulous, I think, might have worked a little better. So we tested that, and most people could get kind of close to articulating what it meant, but there wasn't really anybody who nailed it on the first go. And for our wayfinding system to function, we really need people to understand instantly what that symbol is meant to represent. And so we ended up taking it to a rather large focus group testing scenario. Part of it was online, part of it was in person. And we compared the two symbols, the chevron symbol and the T, or AT, I should say. The breakdown of how that survey or that focus group went is actually super surprising to me. Most people could get, again, with the chevrons, could get close. Movement, interchange, those were all themes that people could identify with the chevrons. But the T, 76% of the people that we surveyed instantly went directly to a transit message or something related to transit. And it was kind of the inverse with the chevrons. Only 25 people got it sort of in the neighborhood of being transit related. So again, others got pretty close, but there wasn't that sort of instant recognition that this was a transit related concept. So looking at those results, we sort of said, oh, we really have to go with the T. There isn't really any other choice here. And I know that, again, there's a temptation that it be something ownable and something unique, and I get it. And ultimately, I wish that there was a more unique thing that we could have done, perhaps. But I am really confident that from a functional perspective, the T is going to work about as good as it possibly can. And the sort of thing that gives me confidence in that is, I think it's Peter Chermayeff. I may have gotten that name wrong, but gentleman who's part of Chermayeff and Geismar, who designed the MBTA T, which the Eglinton renderings, I think, is a direct inversion of that logo, whereas this is somewhat different. He has a quote that he uses when describing their process for arriving at Boston's T, and it didn't have to be unique, it just had to be right. Because at that time, their T was sort of quite similar to Stockholm's. And that's sort of I think the philosophy we're applying here is it's really less important for it to be special or unique or representative of the region in any way, so much as it has to function directly and explicitly for people to use it to identify transit. So in terms of rollout, we are doing our best to grandfather this into the system as best we can. The bus stops were coming up for renewal from a state of good repair perspective, so that's how we ended up with the T there. The first real sort of big use of the T will be on the Eglinton Crosstown, although unfortunately we won't be using our full wayfinding system on the Eglinton Crosstown, at least not initially. But the T will be there and be there in a big way, excuse me. And then obviously through our various other capital programs, it will be in use at stations that are seeing capital builds forthcoming. And we will obviously, as it becomes used more and more throughout our own infrastructure we own, we'll obviously encourage our transit partners to take it up and to use it on their own systems as well.
Awesome. So for the last question, I wanted to ask, where do you see wayfinding going in the future for Toronto, and kind of what excites you, what opportunities do you see, and that sort of thing?
Sure. I think it's a bit of a loaded question, but I'll do my best. So I think in terms of where wayfinding is going as a sort of industry, I think, although I am relatively new to the industry, I'm actually quite old school in that I think that there's a lot of sense that we are going to move into a digital environment, and that people will just be using their phones to find their way around, which absolutely, I use Google Maps as much as anybody. I get that concept, but I think that isn't really representative of how people interact with environments that they're in. Nobody wants to, I think, be looking at their phone constantly. And even if you use Google Maps to find your way around, that helps you make a point A to point B journey, but it doesn't give you any context about the wider city or the wider transit network that you're using. And so even if we were to move to a digital first wayfinding system where the first thing we asked you to do was pull out your phone and plan your journey, I think along the way you are still going to be reliant on signs, on maps, on the physical things that are in the station to help guide you. And I think to suggest that we're ever going to move away from that would really require a more significant change in human behavior, which I don't think is going to be forthcoming. That being said, I'm interested to know just how far that might go and how far away from the more traditional things that we use as wayfinding tools people might be prepared to go, because it's an interesting sort of pivot point for the industry around how we address how people behave. And wayfinding is ultimately about how people behave. It's about the series of decisions that you and I make as we move through space, and supporting those decisions with tools that respond to what the human need is in those moments. So I would say that is the thing I'm most interested in, is understanding how far digital interventions are going to change the industry, and how far we as people are comfortable moving away from the more traditional practices. I would say that specific to Toronto and the GTHA, I think, agnostic of Metrolinx's wayfinding program and our own standard and the T and our sort of encouraging of other providers to adopt it, I think inevitably there is going to be the need for more integration of how we talk about each other, if I can put it that way. So even if ourselves and the TTC use different wayfinding systems, we might use different graphic conventions, we might refer to things in different ways, although our system is specifically designed such that we don't do that. We use existing conventions and we only ever make changes where we see opportunities for improvement, or research has pointed in a direction to if we want to do something different than what's done currently. I think that the key to wayfinding is ultimately that people don't plan or people don't experience journeys within the boundaries of one system. A transit journey is a series of steps that you take, and even within one system, you're still taking a series of steps. You're leaving your house, going to the bus stop, you're then taking the bus to the subway, yada, 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 yada. So within those steps, if there's a hurdle, it creates a big problem for you as a customer. And I think, again, thinking of what steps the customer might take beyond your service area, and thinking about how we can support their onward journey, even if it isn't within the boundaries of our system, I think is going to be really important. And so, again, even if I might, as a sort of graphic design nerd, suggest that it would be great if all the graphic conventions were aligned, I think it's really important that we just talk about each other's systems in a much more significant way than we do currently, and maybe not look at each other as competition necessarily, or anything like that, and really just collaborate a little more than we perhaps traditionally have been doing. And I think the only other sort of aspect of that I would say is that designing from, again, the customer's point of view and their existing knowledge, I think is going to continue to be critically important to the success of any wayfinding system. And I think it's up to us as the people that work in that industry to always understand how we can do better. I think introducing new codes or new concepts or new names for things that don't necessarily relate to the customer's existing knowledge does create a barrier, and that's something that I think we should work hard to try and avoid, even though it's maybe tempting or sort of more ideal if we go for something that's more graphically simple. That can be, I think, a bit of a not a misnomer, but it can be a bit of a mistake to go down that road, that just because something is simple to you, whether it looks simple, but it's simple for someone to understand. So I think a continual interrogation of existing practice and a continued sort of empathy with the user or the customer, and designing from their perspective, I think is going to be critically important to the success of wayfinding, either in the GTHA or anywhere. And again, as we sort of try and adopt and understand digital tools and how we might use them to make the customer or the user's experience that much better.
Well, thanks again, Toban, so much for coming on and chatting with me. And yeah, I hope to talk to you again soon.
My pleasure. And obviously, thanks a lot for having me on. And I hope first yourself and all your viewers are keeping safe, and looking forward to seeing what other contents you put out there. So thanks a lot.
Thanks.